smagu, kad prisijungėt, kad domitės duomenų apsauga. Esu Vidmantas Atėja. Kartu su komanda diegiame inovatyvius duomenų apsaugos sprendimus tiek su viešąja debesyje, tiek lokalius. Iš tikrųjų mes turim tą tokį kaip ir konceptą, kad per 3 vietas, jeigu mes turim viešąją debesyje, mes žiūrim, kaip mes galėtume pagelbėti mūsų klientams su viešąja debesyje, jeigu mes turim poreikį lokaliai infrastruktūrai, mes pagelbėm su lokalia infrastruktūra, jeigu mes turim poreikį duomenų apsaugai, mes įdedam tarp tų dviejų infrastruktūrų dar ir duomenų apsaugą. Jeigu jūs norėtumėt daugiau apie tai pasikalbėti, aš čia turiu įsidėjęs savo QR kodą LinkedIn arba galit man parašyti. Mes tada galėsim daugiau pasikalbėti apie jūsų poreikius. O šiandieną mes papasakosime apie Veeam ir Veeam technologijas. Programa truks kažkur tai apie valandą. Tame tarpe pasiliksime truputėlį laiko klausimam ir atsakymam, kuriuos jūs galėtumėt parašyti Teamsų čate. Mes, jeigu nespėsime atsakyti webinaro metu, tikrai jums visiems atrašysime. Kartu su manimi prezentaciją apie Veeamą pristatys Tomaš Turek. Tomaš yra Veeamo architektas, jis kartu su manim nemažai bendrauja. Jeigu mums atsiranda kažkoks tai poreikis pasikalbėti apie architektūrinius sprendimus, aš tada su juo pabendrauju, pasitikslinu ir jisai darys prezentaciją anglų kalba. Dabar kodėl Veeam? Veeam yra pagal Gartnerio Magic kvadrantą numeris 1 pasaulyje su duomenų apsaugos sprendimais. Jie turi pakankamai diversifikuotą industrijų paketą per visą pasaulį ir sprendimai atitinka tiek didelių įmonių reikalavimus, tiek yra tinkami mažoms įmonėms. Veeamas puikiai dirba su on-preminiais sprendimais, su on-preminė, o lokalia infrastruktūra, bet taip pat puikiai integruojasi ir su viešąja debesyje ir yra suderinamas su šiandienos populiariais hypervisoriais, tiek VMware'as, tiek Nutanix'as, tiek kiti, kurie galbūt yra kažkiek netgi specifiški tam tikrom industrijom. Veeamas turi pagrindinius 3 paketus, kurie dengia tiek nedidelių įmonių poreikius, tiek didelių korporacijų reikalavimus duomenų apsaugai. Iš mano asmeninės patirties su Veeamu dirbu jau 2 metus ir esu tikrai patenkintas, kad pati platforma, pati technologija neriboja mūsų architektų ir mūsų inžinierių diegiant inovatyvius sprendimus duomenų apsaugos. Kiekvieną kartą, kai mes diegiame tos sprendimus, mes galvojame apie 3, 2, 1, 1.0 taisyklę, kuri yra tuo pačiu ir Veeamo rekomendacija. Kur 3 reiškia, kad kaip minimum reikia pasidaryti 3 kritinių duomenų kopijas. 2 tai reiškia, kad tos duomenų kopijos turėtų būti saugomos dviejose skirtingose lokacijose, kur galbūt viena galėtų būti arčiau produkcinės aplinkos, jeigu reikėtų kažką greitai statyti, bet kita turėtų būti nutolusi, reiškia vienetukas. Ir dar kitas vienetukas reiškia, kad duomenų kopija turėtų būti saugoma ant medijos, kuri neturi interneto prieigos arba yra air gap, tam, kad jeigu kažkas atsitiko mūsų produkcijai, kenkėjiškos programos jos negalėtų pasiekti jūsų svarbių duomenų kopijų. Ir aišku, nulis reiškia, kad tos duomenų kopijas, kurias jūs padarot, sukuriat, jos lygiai taip pat sėkmingai ir atsistato. Tai reiškia, kad mes kiekvieną kartą turim turėti galimybę pasitikrinti, ar tos duomenų kopijos atsistato sėkmingai. Nemažiau svarbus yra ir pačio Veeam palaikymas mūsų kaip partnerių, o kartu su mumis jūsų kaip klientų. Ir dėl to šiandieną kartu su manimi dalyvauja ir Tomas Šturek, kuris daugiau papasakos tada apie patį Veeam, apie Veeam sprendimus ir apie Veeam Vault, kuris irgi yra visai nesenai išleistas. Praeitų metų berods lapkritį Veeam paskelbė išleidę Veeam Vault, kur yra duomenų backupų saugojimas, panaudojant Microsoft Azure technologiją už fiksuotą 1 terabaito kainą. Aš dabar persijungsiu į anglų kalbą, perduosiu žodį Tomašui ir tikiuosi, kad pasibaigus mūsų webinarui jūs tikrai įsinešit vertingos informacijos savo įmonės. Ačiū labai. Tomasz, I will be now switching into English and please take over now from me and discuss a little bit more in depth about Veeam capabilities, Veeam Vault, and other very important features that addresses nowadays challenges that we have.
Okay, perfect. Thank you very much, Vidmantas. Hello, everybody. My name is Tomasz Turek. I'm an engineer in Veeam. I believe Vidmantas already introduced me in Lithuanian, however, so I'm just hoping he said only good things there. So, as mentioned, I wanted to talk about two things today. So first of all, what are the features which align Veeam and cybersecurity in general? Because if we think about it in today's environment, it's always the discussion about ransomware, about the protection against ransomware, and backups are very closely connected to it. The reason being that if you are actually hit by malware, backups become your literally last line of defense. So we will discuss the features that you can use proactively, as well as where you can actually store the data to keep it as secure as possible against those modern threats. So you already pretty much saw this slide about Veeam. So what we are offering to our partners, to our customers. In today's webinar, we will be mostly discussing what's happening within Veeam Backup and Replication, which is the backup and recovery scenario. Literally just a few words about monitoring as well. Reason being that monitoring can also help us detect certain threats, not on the level of fighting against ransomware, but on the level of telling you as administrators that your environment behaves in an unusual way. So perhaps this is something that we need to look into because, well, it's an unexpected behavior. So perhaps it's part of an attack of an external threat. But definitely, mostly, we are talking about backups as such. Now, in the very beginning, and this is something that I always like to talk about because not all of you may have Veeam, not everybody may be interested in Veeam, and there are certain policies that you can actually use to keep your data as secure as possible. To be honest, without any particular backup software, because it's down to policy, not necessarily down to technology. And this is, of course, our famous 32110 data protection rule. And again, I'm always discussing this because if you follow it, no matter what software you're using, and I actually saw customers who were not using any backup software at all, but they were still maintaining this data protection rule, and it keeps their data safer than, well, if they would not be doing anything outside of it. So just a quick recap and why we have to follow this rule, what this rule actually means. So first of all, 3 different copies of the data. This might sound simple, but believe it or not, you can actually get this one wrong. So of course, the first copy that we're talking about is the actual machine. It can be virtual machine, can be physical machine, doesn't matter. Vidmantas already mentioned that we handle quite a lot of environments. So of course, those can be cloud machines, those can be application data, file devices, it doesn't matter. And this is one of your copies of the data because this is the production copy. And then the other 2 are, of course, backups. Now, why 2 backups? The reason for this is quite simple. And it's not really due to redundancy of the backup copy, because if you store it on today's modern storage array, this data is going to be safe, right? There are technologies which keep it safe. Of course, you have RAID controllers, which are supposed to make it immune to any driver controller failures. But this is actually down to different scenarios in which you will be using the backup. If you're thinking about user error, then of course you will be recovering data from the primary repository. Why? Because it's very fast, it's simple, it's usually very close to production. However, if we're talking about a ransomware attack, so that's an attack that hits your production environment, usually this virtual machine is going to be encrypted. And because the primary backup copy is very close to production, because it's supposed to be as simple, as efficient, as fast as possible, usually we don't trust the primary backup copy as well. Because if you were hit in your production environment, why wouldn't the primary backup repository also be compromised in some way? It might not be obvious at first, because it may be just a small destruction, maybe just rearranging a couple of blocks inside your backups, but that may be enough to keep your backups unrecoverable in this scenario. So if we're talking about a ransomware attack, if we're talking about generally any cybersecurity incident, your primary source of data recovery should be the secondary repository, which is the repository which is supposed to be a little bit further from production with slightly different configuration, perhaps a different format in which you're storing the data. And this takes us naturally to the second point, which is this number 2, right? So we have 3 copies of data. The 2 is 2 different kinds of media on which you're storing the backups. Now, if you think about it, it's actually quite simple. The most common repository which we see under Veeam, it's just a regular Windows server with some connected disks, right? And this is usually what our customers use as their primary backup repositories. Now, why is it a bad idea to store the second copy in exactly the same format, if you think about it? Well, first of all, if you were actually hit by ransomware, so something attacked your Windows server, it destroyed this Windows server, it destroyed your repository, what's stopping it from attacking your secondary location? It's probably the same Windows server, probably from the same template, probably secured with the same policies that failed in the first place. So this naturally means that if the primary one was destroyed, there is no reason why the ransomware would not spread and attack your secondary repository. And in here, you can actually go crazy with the formats, because the simplest thing that you can actually do is just create a backup repository. Again, a server with disks, which is the cheapest option, and just put a Linux server in here. It's already requiring the malware to understand a little bit more. Because again, let's be honest, a Windows server with an NTFS file system underneath, probably the most common scenario that we see in the world. And by default, this is what ransomware is going to need to learn to attack to infect as many people as possible. Because again, if you think about it, ransomware ransomware attacks in general, well, however this is going to sound, it's a business model, right? We try to create something, malware, as cheaply as possible and get as much return profit as possible. So we are trying to attack the biggest number of possible targets, which in this case are going to be Windows servers. Of course, we can start expanding our malware, our ransomware, to learn Linux, for example, but we have to spend time on it. So not every cyber terrorist group is going to spend time on it. Right? If we're talking about different media, of course, those can be tapes, for example. I would try to draw a tape. Okay, let's pretend this is a tape, actually. Tapes, well, for a very long time in Veeam, we believed that tapes are going to be dead. Why? Because those are sequential devices. They are fairly slow compared to block-based or object-based storage arrays. But as it turned out, well, tape is doing just fine. It's actually doing perfect in the world. And tape is actually one of the most secure ways of storing the data because it's very cost efficient if you're looking at the price per terabyte. And it's also something that you can put offline, right? You can just put it in a different location. And when it's in a different location, when it's taken by the courier, unless the courier has an accident, there is really not much that can happen to this particular tape. But because tape is something that is not exactly simple to use because of its sequential nature, something that was introduced, well, a while ago, but it's becoming popular right now, is going to be the object storage arrays, right? So again, just a device with disks, but presented over the S3 protocol. And it's something that we love as a backup repository. Why do we love it as a backup repository? It's a fairly new protocol compared to the other ones that we can potentially use, which means, again, ransomware needs to learn it. It does not have a file system to attack, so ransomware needs a totally different attack vector to actually infect those arrays. It's not just coming onto the file system and spreading itself on the file system, because technically as soon as ransomware hits an object storage, it gets divided into those objects, it becomes descripted with metadata, and it actually becomes another object on the storage array. So the attack vector that we see on object storage usually relies on attacking the management interface, on trying to corrupt data from this management interface, or trying to delete the buckets as a whole. But again, that's something that ransomware needs to learn. And in addition to that, object storages support something called object lock or immutability, but we will talk about it in just a second. But those are technologies which are keeping the data safe for a specific period of time. So the outcome of the number 2 right here is, well, just store it in different formats. In addition to that, 1, the offsite copy. This is, I think, the most difficult one to talk about, because what is an offsite copy? Everybody has a different definition. For someone, the perfect offsite copy is going to be a server rack standing next to your server room, right? So it's very close, but it's technically something that is separated. For other people, it's going to be a different city. For other people, it will be a different tectonic plate, for example. For others, it will be a different continent. So there is no simple definition of an offsite copy. The way I like to describe it, however, it's a definition that doesn't really tell you anything. It's a location where the same disaster would not strike as your primary server room, as your primary environment. Again, what it means depends on the disaster, depends on the kind of attack that you have. Something that's becoming increasingly popular because it's very simple and it actually matches all of the definitions of a good offsite copy is going to be the cloud. Why the cloud? First of all, it's not going to be your environment, it's somebody else's environment, which from the legal perspective, sometimes you may be like, I don't want to store data at somebody else's environment. Which of course is true. This is why every hyperscaler has a ton of legal documents mentioning how they handle data, how they're compliant with GDPR, with NIS2 directives, with basically everything that, for example, European Union is putting upon us. But the good thing about this being somebody else's environment is that it has a completely different configuration. It's different people who were securing it. It's a different physical location, different network security, different vendors even used for protecting this environment. Meaning that if something was able to penetrate your environment, well, it's not necessarily going to know how to infect an Azure data center, right? Outside of the fact that Microsoft has tons of people who are protecting this environment, they have the red teams, constantly trying to attack it. They have the blue teams constantly trying to defend it. All the teams in between, like purple teams, just sticking everything together to make it more secure. But what I'm getting at is that it's a completely different authentication domain. It's a completely different way of actually handling the infrastructure as such. And this is why we love the cloud. When it comes to cloud, we can use pretty much anything that presents itself over object storage protocols. And this is also the place that Vidmant has already mentioned, where we store something that we call the Veeam Vault, about which we will still talk about in the near future. And the last two things, those are actually based on the recent ransomware threats. So the first one is basically one of the copies have to be immutable or air-gapped. How do we define immutability? How we define air-gap? You cannot alter the copy. You cannot delete the copy unless you put some effort into it. Let's put it this way. So if you think about an immutable copy, the first thing that probably comes to mind, this is going to be the tape, right? As soon as the tape leaves your infrastructure, unless somebody physically destroys it, yeah, it's gonna be pretty much safe. If it's still in the tape library, keep in mind that there are known ransomware in the world which can actually take tapes from the library, erase them, put them back into slots. So yeah, once they're inside of the library, not a great idea. As soon as they leave the infrastructure, perfect location to store the backups. But we also mentioned that those are sequential devices, right? So how else we can approach it? Again, we can use the cloud. We can use an Azure blob. We can use an AWS S3 bucket. We can use pretty much any S3 storage that you can think about. We can use the Veeam Vault in here, so our object storage. There's also a very simple thing called the Veeam hardened repository. This was supposed to be an H, Veeam hardened repository, which is a Linux-based repository that also supports immutability, which does not allow you to actually delete data or alter the data for a specific period of time, right? So keep in mind that those repositories, of course, exist. They're very simple to use. It's not rocket science to actually implement this technology, and it's a great way to keep your data secure. And the last thing, which is zero, which is basically zero errors that you can encounter during restore. And this is nothing else than just testing the backups. Of course, tests can be automated, tests can be manual. Of course, we hate manual testing because of the amount of time this is going to take, but you can actually do it, right? Every once in a while, at least tests, I don't know, a random single machine, so you know in general what to expect. Of course, the perfect scenario is test everything, but it's not always possible. And the reason why we need to test those backups is also because mostly ransomware is going to come alive after a restart of a machine, right? Sometimes you may not see that this machine is already encrypted because it's running, but once you reboot it, or once you recover it from backup, then you will see this beautiful, usually a red screen saying, okay, you have to pay us this many Bitcoins, otherwise your data is lost. If you never tested this backup, if you never rebooted this machine because it's a production server, you might not even know for a certain period of time that all of your environment is basically becoming useless. So yeah, this policy, super important. You can do it with Veeam, you can do it without Veeam. Anything is possible in here. Now, there is a concept which I don't like the name of because, if you think about a cyber bunker, you probably think of specific vendors. Everybody calls it differently. There is a cyber bunker, cyber fortress, I don't know, cyber trenches, super secure, I don't know what else we can use here. Hole in the ground. Everybody calls it differently. The idea here is exactly the same. put a lot of different technologies and make sure that you are safe on multiple levels. So if you look at it how Veeam does it, and with Veeam, keep in mind that we're pretty much storage agnostic or hardware agnostic in general, which means that you can achieve it in different ways in order to be secure. If we're talking about virtualization backup, because virtualization is still the most common part of Veeam backup environment, there are multiple things you can do. The first thing, even before you create a backup, even if you have a storage array which supports storage snapshots, which Veeam, for example, may understand, there's a list of vendors, I can show it to you in a second, create those storage snapshots. Keep them as like a tier 0 backup. Why? Because a lot of malware does not know how to infect specific storages. And we actually had a customer who lost pretty much their whole environment, and the only thing that the ransomware did not understand was the production storage array. The data, yes, the data was encrypted on the regular volumes because, well, those volumes were presented, for example, to vSphere environment. But the snapshot, the malware had no idea how to infect a snapshot. And all the customer had to do is actually revert those storage snapshots. They lost the backups, they lost production, they lost everything. Storage snapshots actually saved them, right? So this is like a tier 0 backup, as we can call it. If you actually start to create backups, then you can store data on multiple different ways to keep yourself secure. The duplication appliances, of course, the two most common ones are going to be data domains. Those are going to be storeonces. Of course, you can also put it, for example, on an exagrid. Why? If you're talking about data domains or storeonces, we used ddbust or we use Catalyst for integration. Those are closed protocols. They are not publicly open. So again, malware has to understand those protocols. If we were talking about, for example, exagrid, or if we were talking about quantum DXIs, those arrays have a Veeam agent running directly on those storage arrays, which means the communication is happening with Veeam protocols, again, which are closed, which means that ransomware has to understand and actually penetrate the Veeam protocol to spread into this kind of an array, right? So it keeps you safer. It's much better than presenting the storage over SMB or over NFS, for example, right? Which are commonly known, and those are usually the best way to be attacked. Also keep in mind, the duplication appliances, they do support immutability. It's called immutability, it's called object lock, it's called retention lock. Again, every vendor calls it differently. It's exactly the same idea. Keep the data not vulnerable to change, let's put it this way, right? Because once you lock it under immutability, let's say for 2 weeks, for those 2 weeks you cannot delete this data, for those 2 weeks you cannot alter the data. We already mentioned this. You can put it on a regular Linux repository. It's called the Veeam hardened repository. And it's a very simple concept. All you need pretty much is a Linux server, or you can actually go to the Veeam website. There is an ISO which is already pre-prepared for you. So it's a very simple deployment, and this also supports immutability. Or you can use object storages, again, S3 protocol, super functional, and it does support object lock, which is also a version of immutability. So keep your backups immutable. Now, when you copy the data to an offsite location, don't use just a regular file copy, of course, right? If you have a supporting technology, again, talking about the duplication appliances, use, for example, Catalyst copy, again, closed protocol. Use a Veeam backup copy job because it's using the Veeam transport agent. Again, a closed protocol. For example, if you have S3 storage arrays, maybe use S3 replication. Again, S3 not as popular with ransomware. As soon as you hit the target location, so you hit your secondary data center, use the same kind of immutable repositories to store the data. Of course, in a different format, we mentioned this. So if you use a Linux repository here, perhaps use an object repository here, right? So this 3-to-1 rule, 2 different media on which you store the backup. Then keep in mind that you have quite a lot of technologies to support you in discovering malware or in quickly recovering from malware. Some Veeam actually supports antivirus scanning. We support inline detection of malware. You can do recoveries in an isolated network environment. If your primary environment gets hit by ransomware, we can change the format of physical machines, of virtual machines, of cloud machines, so you can recover it to a different environment because you do not trust your production environment right now because it was just hit by ransomware. And once you use all those technologies, once you check for ransomware, of course, you can restore it to your target location. And we also discussed the perfect offsite, right, which is the cloud. When we're talking about the cloud, of course, you can use a hyperscaler or you can use the Veeam Vault. Again, we will be touching upon the Vault, how it works, what it actually allows you to do, and how it integrates with Veeam, right? Because again, cloud is going to be perfect because if you have an insider threat, so you have somebody who knows your environment inside out, and they are pretty much the vector of attack, keep in mind that pretty much everything can get destroyed, and they probably don't have access to an Azure or AWS data center, because why would they, right? It's something that's going to be fairly secure. So coming back again to immutability, where we can have immutability, how we can have immutability, and also how to design your repositories to be as safe as possible. Of course, you can have a server with just connected disks. And this is a bad idea, right? Because if you do a Windows repository with, for example, I don't know, NTFS, it does not support immutability. Microsoft is actually, from my knowledge, working on immutability features on their ReFS file system, but it's still going to take a while. If you're talking about NAS devices, yes, they are supported, of course, but also not a great idea. Reason being that it's usually using open protocols. So you're much better, for example, connecting this NAS device to a Linux repository and then creating a Linux hardened repository with Veeam. Again, deduplication appliances, right? Store onces, data domains, exagrids, S3 storage arrays, right? So things that support immutability. So those are all the things that you can actually use in your infrastructure. If we're talking about secondary copies, there is also cloud in here. Why no cloud in the primary repository? Why we don't like people storing data in the cloud as the primary backup? Not because it's less functional, not because it's less safe, simply because it's slower, right? Whenever, if any of you actually use the cloud, the biggest problem with the cloud is the network speed. Not because you don't have a network connectivity, because you may have like a 10 gigabit connection to the world, but because every single hyperscaler will cut down on performance at a specific point. If you egress too much data or you ingest too much data into the cloud, they will start cutting down on your performance. And if you're looking for a super safe repository that's going to be a long-term repository, keep in mind we also support S3 Glacier. We support the archive blob storage. So those archive blobs, this Glacier or Glacier Deep Archive, those are actually tapes underneath, right? Some hyperscalers admit it, others do not. In reality, this is going to be tape presented as object storage. If you remember a couple of years ago, we had those S3 gateways, which were actually putting data on tapes. This is, in a very big simplification, how those tiers work. So they are super cheap to store the data, and they're super expensive to actually recover the data, keep this in mind, and they give you a fairly slow time before your data becomes accessible, right? I believe the default time is going to be like about 8 hours before you even see the data presented to you. Why? Because we have to roll all of those tapes, we have to attach the recovered data onto a regular blob, and then we present you this regular blob from which you can perform a recovery, right? So again, super cool for archival storage, for legal purposes. For a primary disaster recovery storage, yeah, not so much. And if we're talking about immutability, I'll just very quickly show this to you here in the interface, right? When you're creating repositories and you even want the simplest repository to be created, keep in mind that we can create those repositories with Veeam, those Linux repositories with Veeam. So when you're adding a Linux server into Veeam, it doesn't matter what we specify in here. When you're adding a Linux repository, you have two ways of creating it. So you have, let's say, a regular connection, and you have something called the single-use credentials for hardened repository. It means that we are using the root credentials once, not storing it anywhere in our database, only to input our agent in there, and also to establish the immutability flag. And as soon as this flag is established, we get rid of the root credential. We do not use a root user. And if you're not a root user on Linux, you cannot delete this immutability flag, and you cannot shorten the period of immutability. You can only expand it further. So once you do it, once you have such a repository, I believe I should have something like this, hopefully at least. Yeah. So here you can see a specific type of repository. It says, oh, almost hardened. It's not easy to draw with my mouse, unfortunately. And you look at the configuration of this repository. Well, it looks like a regular repository. Server name, the location where I'm storing the backups. And there is this one very important thing: make recent backups immutable for 7 days. It means that the latest 7 days that you have on your repository, it's not deletable, it's not modifiable. So if you're hit by ransomware, for example, something stole the credentials with which Veeam uses this repository, it's not able to delete those backups. If an administrator logs in with those Veeam credentials to this server, they're not able to delete the backups, right? And even me right now, I don't have a checkbox to remove it even, because it's not possible. And I have a 7-day period. If I try to input 4, it's gonna be red. Why? Because it was 7. So the minimum time I can present here is going to be 7 days. I cannot make this flag any shorter inside of my interface, right? So this is going to keep the data as safe as possible. And you can do it also on object storage repositories. You can also do it in the cloud repositories. It doesn't really matter from our perspective. Let me see if I have some backup actually lying on one of those repositories. I am blind right now. Okay, we will actually have it on S3 immutable, so we will talk about it when we get to the Veeam Vault. One more thing: if you're unsure if your storage array supports immutability or supports object log, there is a website called Veeam Ready. You can just find it in Google, so it's very simple, and you can go Technical Alliance Program. And there is a section which we can actually use in here for specific purposes, right? So you can, for example, have object level repositories, right? Or if you're looking for a specific type of repository, what kind of a repository is it? Like, is it a hardened repository or something else, right? So let's put, for example, Veeam Ready object. Let's do it this way. And you can see right here, let's say we are looking at an Amazon S3 bucket. You can use it as a regular object repository, and it does support immutability as well, right? If we're looking at on-premises devices, I don't know, let's look, for example, ECS, right? Again, it can be object, it can be immutable. Keep in mind that not every S3 repository supports immutability, because every vendor implements the S3 protocol slightly different. So for example, right here, backup target object, but no immutability, right? So this is something that you can check. This is an open website. No need to log in, no need to do anything. You can just see it in here. Right, and what are some of the supporting technologies that you can also use? During the backup, we have something called the inline malware scanning. There is an AI engine which actually scans the contents of the virtual machine. It scans the blocks of a virtual machine to look for unusual behaviors. So we are checking, like, were there any changes to compression, because compression can also be used to destroy your data. Were there any changes with encryption? Because again, encryption, malware, different or weird behavior of files, like a lot of small changes to the headers of the files. So perhaps headers were corrupted. What else? We're also scanning the file index of those virtual machines. Are there any are there any file extensions that we know are associated with malware? So for example, if we find a file which is called, like for example, .server, we know that this is an extension connected with the Cerberus ransomware, right? So we immediately know you were struck with this. If we find an extension that we do not know, but it behaves in a similar way that those associated with ransomware, we will also tell you, right? This looks weird. This looks like a ransomware created extension. We are looking for binaries of known ransomwares, right? So we're looking at file names, we're looking at file signatures. I believe there's a database of over 4,000 ransomwares right now that is included inside of Veeam. And of course, this is something that is being updated pretty much daily to keep you as safe as possible. What we're also looking at, we're looking at ransom notes. If we find a ransom note that we know, we already tell you, okay, there is a ransom note from a ransomware, I don't know, called Petya, let's say, right? Because we know its exact format. If we find a file that looks like a ransom note because it contains specific words, it contains Bitcoin wallet addresses, it contains onion links, things like this, we tell you, okay, we found a suspicious file that looks like a ransom note. And this is all done during the backup operation. In the most recent update to Veeam, there's also something we call the indicators of compromise, right? So we're looking for software on those virtual machines and on the Veeam servers. We're looking for software which may be used by attackers to actually do something with your environment. And keep in mind, if you're using Veeam, it's extremely simple to enable those features, right? We go to malware detection. It's a big button right here, so it's going to be hard to miss in the main menu. And all of those options are available in here. If you want this inline scanning with this machine learning engine, just select the checkbox, and then it's analyzing all of the blocks of your machines, looking for any abnormalities. If you want to check the file system, so we're looking at suspicious files, we're looking at suspicious file behavior, renaming of the files, we're looking at those ransom notes, at the known binaries. Again, this is just a checkbox. If you have a local ransomware, for example, there is something created in Lithuania, for example, and it's not yet known around the world, so maybe it didn't happen to be on the Veeam target list. You can just input those extensions in here and they will be automatically scanned by Veeam as well. And the latest addition to Veeam is this indicators of compromise detection. So we're looking at specific tools which may be used by attackers. And you can check what tools those are and how they can be used. So for example, gaining initial access, some piece of software to scan for vulnerabilities, for data collection. What else is there? Credentials access, a piece of software designed to retrieve passwords, not something that you expect on a production virtual machine, for example. Password cracker tools, right? So things that are supposed to just crack your password. Network discovery rules before ransomware is able to spread to different machines. Lateral movement, so basically actually gaining access to those other machines and being able to copy itself between different servers. Different keyloggers that are being scanned. Data exfiltration software, so software that can be used to steal your data, for example. Gaining access and actually having executable access on your servers. And lastly, tools that can be used for data destruction, right? So just not encrypting the data, but literally deleting the data so you're unable to recover from a ransomware incident. And scanning all of this is just selecting those checkboxes, right? So it's extremely simple. And once the backups are created, there are 3 additional things that you can use, right? You can have an on-demand scan using your antivirus software, or again, in the newest edition of Veeam in version 12.3, we have an integrated piece of antivirus software called the Veeam Threat Hunter, right? So if you don't have an antivirus which can integrate itself with Veeam, of course, there is a list of available integrations. There is an integrated antivirus. Of course, it's not an antivirus created by Veeam because, well, we do not know how to do it well. There are companies who do it better. So in this edition, and don't get used to this information because this might change at any time, In this edition, this is actually an OEM'd Bitdefender engine. The reason why it's chosen for this edition is that they allowed us to actually tweak the engine a little bit to increase the performance of scanning of the Veeam backups, right? So if you compare the performance of scanning a Veeam backup format, it's approximately 2 or 3 times faster than just a regular antivirus because it's targeted only at scanning Veeam. And keep in mind, if you have the Veeam license, this is included. It's not an additional cost. You can scan those backups, right? So it's nothing that needs to be configured on its own. There's also the Sure Backup option, right? Sure Backup option meaning that you can test the recoverability of your virtual machines in an isolated network environment. If you have an enterprise edition, if you're a new user, you already have it because we only sell one edition right now. We used to sell different editions beforehand. So this allows you to boot up your virtual machines from a backup file, test them in an isolated network environment, check for heartbeat, check for ping, check for applications, run antivirus scanning, and after the tests, it shuts down the machines and it just gives you a report saying, okay, was everything successful or not? And the last thing that you can use, which I don't want to use ever, pretty much, is something called the secure restore scanning. So you're scanning with the antivirus software during a restore operation, so when you're restoring to production. Why I don't like this feature? I mean, it's a cool feature, like, don't get me wrong. Why I don't like it? Because if you're hit by a disaster and you need to recover stuff, you don't have time for an antivirus software to scan your environment, right? You want to do it as quickly as possible, and you cannot waste a couple hours just waiting for the antivirus to finish its scanning. So this is why I prefer that you actually run those scans in here, because those are test scans. They are on your terms. You do it at your own time, at your own convenience, before a disaster actually strikes. Oh, what have I done in here, actually? I apologize for that. I seem to have drawn too much, and my drawing software has decided to stop working on me. Okay, sorry. Right, so generally it's a much better idea to do it during the testing phase. And lastly, oh, actually, I will just very quickly show you. This is just a very quick thing. Of course, in the same location, so malware detection, there is the signature detection option. And in here, you can use the Veeam scanner, which is the Veeam integrated engine, or you can integrate with your own antivirus. And it's optional. You want the Veeam engine? Sure. You want to have integration with your own antivirus? Sure. And then, for example, what you can do, this is the on-demand scan that I can show you. For example, you can just choose a backup of a machine, and there is an option called Scan Backup, right? And then it's going to scan the restore points, for example, with the Veeam antivirus, looking for the latest clean. You can check all of the backups within a certain range, and you can scan every single backup if you want to be sure that everything that you have created is actually safe, right? So you can do all this directly from the interface. Now, remember about monitoring, because monitoring can also give you information about different patterns of usage for virtual machines. So basically, it means that if there is a suspicious usage of CPU, of memory, of disk, it may look like a machine being hit by ransomware because it's doing the encryption. If in addition to that there is an abnormal network traffic, it can also mean that your data gets stolen. So this is something that you can look into. If you have an unexpectedly large incremental backup file, what can it mean? It can also mean that the machine was already encrypted and you're pretty much backing up encrypted data. This is why a lot of blocks have changed, because those are new blocks once they're encrypted. So if you're expecting like a 10% change increment and you have like a 100% change increment, most likely something is wrong with the machine. Of course, it can be a false positive. Maybe you have a very intrusive antivirus which puts its flag on every single file, disrupting the block structure. But it's not always the case. Sometimes it's just a ransomware that can hit you. And now coming back to the last part, we mentioned this bunker already, right? and we mentioned cloud as the perfect offsite. Now, keep in mind that, of course, you have hyperscalers, but if you don't want a separate agreement with Microsoft, with Amazon, or you don't have the knowledge how to manage the cloud, there is an offering right now created by Veeam, which basically simplifies it for you, because we take on the configuration, the deployment of those blobs, and you're basically just an end user of this kind of repository. Right? So the idea of something we call the Veeam Vault is to make it as simple as possible, right? It's supposed to be fully automated, zero cloud knowledge required. And again, if you remember our 3-2-1 data protection rule, we mentioned that the cloud is a nice thing because it's separated, right? Keep in mind that if you're storing data in a Veeam Vault, I will try to draw it with a different color. If here is you as our customer, and here is Veeam Vault, right? Even if you're, for example, an Azure user, this is your authentication domain, but you are connecting to a Veeam Vault, so a blob, which is part of our tenant, right? So this is a completely different authentication domain. Let's put it this way, authentication domain. So you don't have access to our tenant. You don't have access to our configuration. You have no idea what's happening inside of our Azure. All we are gonna give you is this piece of storage, right? Everything else is going to be a black box for you. And we also like to keep it that way because, well, if you know it, if you have access to it, then so does ransomware. Right, so what are some of the differentiators of the Vault? Why is it cool? One of the biggest things, and this is like a nice differentiator, is that everything is going to be included, right? The price is per terabyte, so you pay only for the terabytes here. Right, so there is a terabyte storage. But if you know hyperscalers, terabytes is only part of the cost. The second part of the costs are the API calls, right? And if you're buying the advanced edition of the Vault, you don't care about the API cost. You can read as much data as you want. It does not generate any additional hidden cost to you. Right? And if you have your own blob in your own subscription, this is something that you need to take into account. The more data you recover from a regular blob or a regular S3 bucket, the more additional cost you are going to have to pay. Right? It's scalable, it's a blob, you can basically make it as large as you want. If you bought initially, let's say 10 terabytes and you run out of space, you buy another 10, we join them together, and it's going to be a 20 terabyte total capacity, right? So again, because it's in the cloud, we can expand it pretty much infinitely. From the, let's say, technical perspective, what's underneath? This is a cool blob, which means, okay, it's not a hot blob, but the performance difference between a hot blob and cool blob is non-existent. The only difference is the handling of the API calls. But again, you do not care about those API calls, so it doesn't really matter. From the performance perspective, it's the same. We don't use cold blobs because they are slower. We don't use archive blobs, at least not yet. Again, because those are meant for archival, not for a regular backup repository. Now, we mentioned that this is a completely different domain, right? Because this is our tenant. So there is basically an air gap, right? You do not have access to our tenant. We do not have access to your infrastructure. So if we get hacked, well, your infrastructure is safe. If you get hacked, well, our infrastructure is safe, and your backups stored within our infrastructures are also safe. Every single blob that you create, every single vault that you create is always going to be encrypted, and it's encrypted on multiple levels. It's encrypted in flight, so as soon as it leaves your infrastructure, the transit data is already encrypted. And then there are two additional layers of encryption. The blob itself is encrypted, and the key is stored in Veeam, right? The blob as a whole, but also every single backup chain that you send into the vault, right? So specific backups that are being created, they have to be encrypted, right? We will tell you, okay, you are sending data to our vault, it needs to be encrypted, otherwise we will not take the data. And because it's you encrypting those backup files, you store the encryption keys for those backups. So again, if you are hacked, the attacker gets your keys to the backups, but they have no idea how to access the vault as a whole. If somebody hacks us, they can decipher the blob itself, but they have no idea how to access your backup files because it's you storing those encryption keys. In addition to that, every single vault is always immutable. You can specify the immutability period, which means we cannot delete your data, you cannot delete your data, ransomware cannot delete your data, Azure cannot, we cannot even close our Azure subscription, like our tenant, as long as there is immutable data, right? Simply Microsoft does not allow us to do it at all, right? So this data is also going to be safe. And from the perspective of durability, or let's start configuration first. This is as simple as it gets. I will show it to you in a second. And in terms of durability, depending on the edition that you get, it's either locally redundant storage or zone redundant storage, which is going to be used within the vault, right? Because there are two editions of the vault. One of them is called the Foundation Edition. Second one is Advanced, and there are two primary differences. In the Advanced Edition, you don't care about the API calls, they're unlimited. In the Foundation Edition, it's 20% of your capacity per year, right? So if you have 10 terabytes of capacity, you can read or recover 2 terabytes without additional cost. Anything over that is just a regular Microsoft pricing. We do not put any overhead on it, but let's say up to 2 terabytes is going to be included. And the second difference is the way we store the data. So data locality. In the Foundation Edition, it's a specific data center which is going to be used. In the Advanced Edition, it's going to be a region, which means it's going to be 3 data centers in which this data is going to be stored. And thus the differences in the geo redundancy, right? Because locally redundant storage means you have a data center and you have 3 copies of your data within this data center. In zone redundant storage, it means you have a primary data center and a copy of your data, and you have 2 different data centers with an additional copy of your data, right? So this is safe from a rack failure, disk failure, basically all of those kind of disasters. In zone redundant storage, you're basically safe from a data center failure because you're automatically going to be failed over to a different data center. How this works, it's extremely simple. You as a user, you get a very simple web-based interface to manage the vaults. And once you create a vault, of course, this is a separate blob, separate storage account actually per vault, which is being created. And then the connectivity goes directly between your infrastructure and the vault, right? It does not go through any additional Veeam services because we just want you to have direct connection to the storage without any intermittent software along the way. And this is the list of the data centers which you can actually use for the vault purposes. Not every Azure data center is present here, of course. The reason for that is that Microsoft does not allow us to use every data center. And there are 2 reasons why not. Reason number 1 is that new data centers do not have all of the services up and running because Microsoft puts the core services first, then they expand the offering. So not every data center supports everything that we need for the vault to run. This is one of the reasons, for example, like Poland, we have a data center built quite recently, is not yet available here. And the second reason, I think the more important one, is that Microsoft needs to have enough resources in a data center to handle potential customers. Again, I will use the data center in Poland as an example. Within the first month of this data center being up and running, you could not create a single virtual machine inside of this data center. Why? Because we were getting communication from Microsoft, okay, the over-provisioning of this data center is so high that we cannot guarantee resources, so please use a different data center. And we cannot have this happening with storage, right? They need to have enough storage to allow us to do that. And also, as you can see right here, there are two different types of data centers. So here you can use the Foundation and the Advanced Edition. And for example, in Switzerland, you can only use the Foundation Edition. Why is that? Because in Germany, we have a whole region. There are at least 3 data centers we can use. And in Switzerland, there are no regions. So there's only a single data center that we can use to store the data, right? This is why the difference. Within those data centers, you can use any of them, you can mix them, we don't care, it doesn't really matter from our perspective. I will again move to the lab here and I will quickly show you, this is just an extract from the this web-based interface. I do not have access to it, so I have to show it to you like this. This is what it looks like once you create the vaults, right? You can create multiple vaults. It's absolutely not a problem. And as you can see right here, right, there is a vault in Canada, there is a vault in India, and there is a vault in Australia, right? So within those data centers, you can spread your backup traffic however you want to do it. And when you actually add a vault, this is again something that's going to be extremely simple, because this is all of the information that you are giving us, right? Give it a name, what kind of subscription you're using, so Foundation or Advanced, specify a country, and if it's the Advanced Edition, so this is the primary data center, specify the Azure region which you want to use. And that's it. After that, we automatically create the vault, we configure the vault, everything is going to be done for you. And how to integrate this with Veeam? Again, super simple. Because this is a repository, right? We go to repositories, you click add repository, and it's going to be hard to miss Veeam Data Cloud Vault, right? Quite simple. Once you click it, there are 2 options to authenticate. You can put manual credentials. So for example, again, let me come back to this part here. For example, you have multiple administrators, multiple backup servers, and I only want to give them access to Canada, right? So I give them the storage account name, I give them the access key, and the administrator only sees this vault. He does not see other vaults, right? So this is this manual input of credentials, right? So I specify the storage account name and the shared key. If I want to have access to everything, I do not select this checkbox, and instead of selecting a specific vault, I just authorize to the Veeam account, and every single vault will be visible in here, right? Once we have a vault, I have a vault here that I can edit for you. So let me do this. Once we have a vault, next. You can see right here, it is going to be immutable as well, right? This is grayed out. You cannot change immutability. You cannot do anything with immutability. It has to be immutable. Otherwise, it's not going to work. It's not going to work at all, right? So this is pretty much the entire configuration of this repository. And now you can use this vault pretty much anywhere, right? You can create backup jobs based on the vault. So for example, I actually have a job which is sending data directly to the vault in here, right? So you will just see it as a regular repository present on the repository list, right? So it's the same as any block-based or local repository that you see available. And the coolest thing about it is that you lose no functionality, right? If you look at a regular disk-based storage, let's look, for example, Linux VMs, because I believe it's also Linux in the vault. What are the recovery options possible? You can do instant recovery, you can recover the entire virtual machine, you can virtualize it to the cloud, you can change the hypervisor if you wish to do so. So those are all of the regular recovery options that you have available with Veeam. And now if we go to the vault, so the object storage in the cloud, we expand the backup. As you can see, you can do everything exactly the same way. There is no limitation to the functionality. There is no limitation as to what you can and cannot do within those environments, right? So not only is it separated, it is a fully functional object storage working the same way as any other on-premises repository that you may have available in your infrastructure. So I think I went like 5 minutes over time. I hope this is okay. So this is going to be from my side.
Actually, just 4 minutes.
Perfect.
Still okay. And we have one question.
Okay, perfect.
Does malware detection work on the basic version of Veeam backup and replication, or do I need to purchase a plus license? I believe it is being referred to the socket-based licensing model, yeah?
I believe that it is in the plus licensing, and the malware detection features in general, they require the advanced edition, which is Veeam Backup Replication and Veeam 1, because Veeam 1 takes over some of the, let's say, monitoring logic of the infrastructures. So you need the Enterprise Plus and you need Veeam 1 in order for all those features to work correctly.
And I believe there would be also, correct me if I'm wrong, but there will be as well an option to migrate to the wool, yeah, from the socket. And
yes, yes.
This could be also an option, yeah, to have.
Correct.
And for now, we do not have any more questions here. Then maybe I will switch over into Lithuanian, Tomas now. We'll thank everyone for being here. Stay here, don't go away. Taigi norėjau visiems padėkoti už tai, kad prisijungėte, už tai, kad išklausėte. Aš manau, kad tikrai buvo pakankamai daug įdomios informacijos. Taip pat Tomas pasidalino apie naujoves, kaip jos galbūt galėtų pagelbėti mum. Oh, we have one more question, Tomas. How does it called air gap, as it has to have init connection still?
Yeah, this is why we put it as a logical air gap, so to speak, because like it's an air gap on the level of infrastructures. To be honest, the only true air gap that you can have is, of course, either a removable disk or a tape device. So because we want to keep everything connected to be available for restore, even though it has the connection, if it's immutable, even though you can connect to this backup, you cannot delete it, you cannot alter it. And this is actually a funny story, if I may digress here very quickly. We actually had a customer who bought an on-premises S3 storage array, and they went too far with immutability period. Instead of selecting like 90 days, they put in 900 days. I don't know, finger slipped or whatever. And they soon figured out that, okay, we went too far. We need to, delete some of the data. We need to shorten this period. So they called us. We said, okay, you cannot delete the backups, even though they grew too large. So they called the manufacturer. Manufacturer says, yeah, there is no way to reconfigure it. So the customer said, okay, I can send the array to the factory. Maybe you can do something like that. And the answer was, it will not do anything. The only thing that the customer could do, and they had to do, was remove the disks, format the disks using some sort of an external, let's say, tool or storage array, put in the blank disks, reinitialize the array, so basically go back to factory settings, and he was left with a blank storage array. There was no software way to actually delete all of this data. So it's not a true air gap, because yes, there is connectivity, but it's as close to an air gap as we can possibly be in terms of technology.
Okay, thank you. Taip pat priminsiu, kad prezentacija bus pasidalinta su visais webinare dalyvavusiais. Taip pat, jeigu turėsiu daugiau klausimų, galite parašyti atėję pardavimų skyrių arba žmogui, su kuriuo jūs turite pagrindinį kontaktą iš atėjos, ir tie visi klausimai tikrai atsidurs ant mano stalo ir mes peržiūrėję galėsim tuos klausimus taip pat atsakyti. Jeigu aš negalėsiu atsakyti, aš paprašysiu, kad Tomašas padėtų man tus klausimus atsakyti, bet mes tikrai juos atsakysime. Taigi, su šiuo pasakymu aš tada norėčiau dar kartą visiems padėkoti ir palinkėti gražios likusios dienos. Ačiū visiems, viso gero. Thank you all. Bye bye.
Thank you very much. Bye bye.